Judge Morgan mocked the teen girl in court, thinking she was just another clueless defendant, until she started dismantling the case like a legal prodigy, leaving the room in stunned silence. It was a grey Monday morning at the Brookridge County Courthouse just outside Boston. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, rows of spectators shifting in their seats, barely acknowledging the small figure sitting at the defendant's table. Arianna Bell, 18, stood accused of serious financial fraud tied to a digital banking breach, an accusation that painted her as a dangerous hacker. The case had already drawn local media attention, not because of any damning evidence, but because no one could understand how a teenager ended up at the center of a cybercrime scandal worth over $300,000. Presiding over the case was Judge Julius Morgan, 61, a man known less for fairness and more for his biting sarcasm and impatience, especially toward young people whom he considered entitled and reckless. From the moment he walked in, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. With a dismissive glance toward Arianna, Morgan smirked and leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting this to be a routine conviction. But it wouldn't be. Not today. Arianna Bell didn't look like someone who belonged in a courtroom. At least, not to the people already in it. Dressed in a plain navy cardigan, worn sneakers, and jeans that hung just a little too loose, she stood out for all the wrong reasons. No suit. No lawyer by her side, just a small canvas bag tucked beneath the table and a steady look in her eyes. From the moment she walked in, the whispers started. Spectators in the gallery exchanged amused glances. Even the bailiff gave a slight shake of his head as he closed the door behind her. Judge Julius Morgan, perched high above in his leather chair, took one look and chuckled. "Miss Bell," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "you do realize this isn't your college debate club, right?" Laughter rippled across the courtroom. It was the kind of moment that made the air thicken with quiet judgment. The kind of moment that could crush someone unprepared. But Arianna didn't blink. She kept her hands folded in front of her, unmoving, her face unreadable. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Claire Reynolds wasted no time getting into her rhythm. Polished, articulate, and confident, she began outlining the case with the ease of someone who had already made up her mind. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant is directly tied to the fraudulent transfer of over $300,000 through manipulated banking portals. The IP address used in the breach was traced to her home. The device used to initiate the transfer was logged into under her username. We have financial records, access logs, and digital trails that all point back to Miss Bell." As Reynolds spoke, she moved fluidly between slides and documents, projecting confidence with every step. The jury nodded along, some scribbling notes. It looked airtight. A done deal. Arianna's name had already been placed in the same mental folder as guilty. In the back row, sitting almost motionless with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, was Veronica Bell, Arianna's mother. A retired court clerk who had spent over 20 years working behind the scenes of the justice system. She knew exactly how quickly perception could become reality in a room like this. She watched her daughter with eyes that didn't blink, didn't flinch. There was no panic in her expression, only a stillness that hinted at something deeper, something quiet, unshakable. To the rest of the courtroom, Arianna looked like a lamb led to slaughter. But to her mother, she looked exactly as she had every time she'd faced down bullies in school, debated teachers on flawed grading, or spent hours arguing legal theory over dinner. Calm, focused, dangerous in the way only someone who truly understood the rules could be. And while the rest of the courtroom chuckled, Veronica Bell didn't smile. She just sat there, waiting, because she knew something they didn't. Arianna hadn't come to beg for mercy. She'd come to dismantle the case from the inside out. Arianna stood slowly, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape that echoed louder than expected in the quiet courtroom. All eyes turned to her. She didn't wait for anyone's cue, didn't glance toward the court-appointed attorney, seated 2 rows back, who had yet to utter a single word. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I'll be representing myself." The room went still. Even the sound of paper rustling seemed to pause. Judge Morgan raised an eyebrow, leaned forward slightly, and let out a dry laugh that rang out through the gallery. "This ought to be entertaining," he muttered, gesturing for her to proceed with a wave of his gavel hand. Across the aisle, Ada Reynolds adjusted her blazer and folded her arms, clearly amused. Arianna, unfazed, stepped forward with measured calm, setting a printed copy of the prosecution's tech report on the table. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, "you stated earlier that the IP address used to transfer the funds was traced to my house. Is that correct?" Reynolds nodded once, confident. "That's what the report says. Yes." Arianna held up the document with 2 fingers, like it weighed nothing. "But did the report clarify whether the IP address belonged to my specific device or just the home router?" Reynolds blinked, thrown off by the precision of the question. "It was traced to your residence," she began, but Arianna didn't let her finish. "Right, my residence, a household that includes 4 family members, 3 laptops, 2 smart TVs, and 1 shared network." Her voice remained calm, clinical. "No MAC address, no device fingerprint, no evidence tying the data transfer to my personal login at the time of the breach." She turned toward the judge now. "Your Honor, this report is based entirely on an IP address without any verification of the originating device. That's like finding a letter on your front porch and assuming every person inside the house wrote it." A few jurors leaned forward. The courtroom, previously filled with quiet skepticism, now carried a hum of curiosity. Arianna wasn't done. She flipped to page 3 of the report and held it up. This analysis was conducted by a junior tech investigator. No expert testimony, no cross-examination opportunity, no detailed forensic audit. The report is built on assumptions and submitted as fact. She let the words hang, knowing their weight. There was no digital chain of custody log submitted, no metadata from the transfer. And, Your Honor, there's no surveillance footage. No security camera footage showing me accessing the computer in question. No time-stamped logs placing me physically near the bank's breached server during the incident. She stepped back slightly, still facing the judge. What we have is circumstantial data dressed up to look like certainty. Judge Morgan, who had been resting his chin in his hand, now lowered it slowly, fingers tapping against the wood. Reynolds began flipping through her notes, her confidence slipping ever so slightly. Arianna turned to the jury. "This case hinges on the assumption that because I live in the house, and because I'm young and understand computers, I must be the one who did it." She paused, her voice firm. "But assumptions aren't proof, and in a court of law, they shouldn't be enough to destroy someone's future." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but electric. Arianna had just cracked the surface, but already the narrative in the room had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. Arianna took a breath, her hands steady as she pulled a neatly bound folder from her bag and laid it flat on the defense table. She opened it with the same composure one might see in a seasoned attorney, flipping to a tabbed section marked Independent Analysis. Her tone sharpened, not with anger, but with precision. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit corroborating evidence from my internet service provider. The logs confirm that at the exact time of the alleged data breach, I was logged into my university's online lecture platform, engaging in a real-time constitutional law class with both geolocation data and access timestamps to prove it." She paused, letting the words settle. "The IP in question may have come from my home router, but I wasn't physically there. I was logged in from a location 15 miles away on a university network with digital records to back it up." She handed a packet to the bailiff to distribute to the court, including the judge and the jury. The pages weren't filled with conjecture. They were filled with code, timestamps, login histories, and network IDs. "The prosecution ignored this," she said calmly, "just like they ignored the statement submitted 2 weeks ago by cybersecurity expert Dr. Lyle Brenner, who, for the record, holds 2 federal patents in digital forensics and reviewed the prosecution's tech report at my request." She held up another document. Dr. Brenner's analysis outlines multiple technical flaws in the original investigation, including the high probability that the IP address used in this crime could have been spoofed or masked through a third-party intermediary, commonly known as a relay proxy, which the report failed to account for entirely. She turned toward the jury again, locking eyes with a woman in the front row. "It's like sending a letter from your neighbor's mailbox and then accusing them of writing it, without even checking the handwriting." A few jurors scribbled down notes, Arianna pressed forward. Furthermore, the digital evidence was obtained through a remote data sweep initiated by a private contractor hired by the bank's internal team, before a formal search warrant had been issued. That means every file, every device scan, every network probe was conducted without proper judicial oversight. She let that hang for a moment, turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, that's not only a procedural error, it's a violation of both the Fourth Amendment and multiple provisions under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act." A murmur swept through the gallery. Arianna didn't flinch. If the prosecution wants to present forensic data as central to their case, they are obligated to show the court that it was collected legally, analyzed independently, and interpreted transparently. None of those conditions were met here. She took a step back from the podium, voice still clear, not raised. This isn't just about digital footprints or data packets. It's about due process, about making sure that the tools of justice aren't wielded like weapons against the uninformed. At the prosecution's table, Reynolds flipped through her binder, her fingers stiff, her expression no longer smug. Judge Morgan, arms now crossed, said nothing, but his eyes had shifted from amused to unsettled. In less than 4 minutes, Arianna had unraveled the technical foundation of the state's entire case, replacing it with reasonable doubt laid out in sharp, methodical layers. What began as mockery was turning, piece by piece, into something undeniable, a reckoning. Arianna reached back into her folder one last time, this time pulling out a document with a gold-stamped letterhead bearing the insignia of Sentinel Corps Cybersecurity, one of the top-tier digital security firms on the East Coast. She held it up, her voice steady but carrying more weight now. "This is my internship contract from 3 months ago with Sentinel Corps. During my time there, I flagged a vulnerability in their encryption framework. A vulnerability that, if left unpatched, could be exploited to reroute encrypted data streams through unverified proxies." She looked directly at Ada Reynolds. That vulnerability was never addressed. Weeks later, that exact backdoor was used in the breach at Ledgestone Bank, the very incident I'm being accused of orchestrating. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Arianna continued without flinching. "Now here's where it gets interesting. 2 weeks before I was let go from the internship, I submitted a report flagging suspicious login behavior tied to a company intern who was repeatedly accessing client-side tools without authorization." She paused, then turned to face the jury. That intern was Jared Whitmore, the son of Ledgestone Bank's CEO. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Arianna pressed forward. "After I submitted the internal complaint, my access was revoked, and I was removed from the project under the pretense of non-compliance. A week later, the breach occurred, and shortly after that, I was arrested." Her hands were still, her words were razor-sharp. The connection was obvious. I raised alarms, they buried them. She stepped toward the judge, eyes locked. This information, including a digital paper trail of my security reports and internal emails, was turned over to local authorities. It was acknowledged, then quietly removed from the record. Arianna turned toward Reynolds, who now sat frozen, her posture rigid. "Your office received those same documents 3 days after my arrest. You chose not to include them in your discovery packet." The silence that followed was suffocating. Judge Morgan's expression, once smug, had cracked into something unfamiliar. For the first time since the trial began, he looked at Arianna not as a foolish girl playing lawyer, but as someone who had just shattered the entire scaffolding of the case he thought would be an easy ruling. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, no longer masking the discomfort on his face. The jury glanced among themselves, some shaking their heads, others scribbling notes furiously. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer focused on Arianna's guilt. It was unraveling the question of who had something to hide, and suddenly it wasn't her. Judge Morgan sat motionless for a long moment, eyes fixed on the defense table, the weight of the courtroom pressing down like a held breath. Then, with a slow exhale and a quiet tap of his gavel, he finally spoke. "Given the inconsistencies in the evidence, the mishandling of key documentation, and the failure to disclose material facts during discovery, this court has no choice but to dismiss all charges against Miss Bell. The defendant is acquitted, case dismissed." For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Then it erupted. A wave of stunned murmurs and scattered applause spread through the gallery like wildfire. Someone in the back sobbed softly. A reporter near the aisle stood up so fast her notepad flew from her lap. Flashbulbs began to go off in rapid succession as journalists scrambled to document the moment. At the prosecution's table, Ada Reynolds stared straight ahead, pale and speechless, while Judge Morgan leaned back in his chair, the rigidness in his posture finally giving way to something heavier, maybe resignation, maybe regret. He glanced at Arianna once more, this time with no sarcasm, no superiority. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, more grounded. "Miss Bell, you should consider law school." The words hung in the air with unexpected sincerity. Arianna didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on the one person who had never looked away. Her mother. Arianna Bell stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly together, eyes glistening with tears. Not from fear or anger, but pride. Her chest rose with a shaky breath as their eyes met, and for the first time since Arianna had walked into that courtroom, her daughter smiled. A small, knowing smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet victory. She walked toward her mother, her steps unhurried, her shoulders straight. The flashes from the cameras didn't faze her. Neither did the voices calling her name or the buzz of reporters already preparing headlines. This moment wasn't for them. It was for the woman who had taught her to read court transcripts before bedtime, who had helped her understand case law before she could drive, who had sat through every hearing with unwavering belief. When Arianna finally reached her, Veronica pulled her into a tight embrace, burying her face in her daughter's shoulder. "You scared the life out of me," she whispered with a laugh that broke slightly at the edges. Arianna smiled into the hug. "Had to take the risk," she replied softly. The two stood there for a beat longer, holding on to the silence as the rest of the courtroom buzzed around them. Judge Morgan remained at the bench, but his expression had changed completely. He no longer saw a defendant. He saw a force, a young woman who had walked into his courtroom underestimated and walked out a symbol of something far greater. The power of knowledge, the courage to speak up, and the strength to hold a broken system accountable. The moment that would later explode across social media came not with shouting or spectacle, but with one sharp sentence. As the courtroom held its breath, Arianna turned to the prosecutor, her voice calm, unwavering, and devastating in its clarity. "You don't have to fear the truth," she said, "unless you already know it's not on your side." Someone in the gallery gasped. The words sliced through the tension like a blade. Clean, precise, unforgettable. Within hours, the clip was trending across platforms. Arianna Bell. Truth over titles and justice redefined flooded timelines. The image of an 18-year-old girl in a cardigan calmly dismantling a seasoned prosecutor became a symbol of something larger. News anchors ran segments calling it the trial that flipped the system, while law students dissected her closing points frame by frame. But what truly resonated wasn't just her intellect, it was her courage. Arianna didn't walk into court to prove how smart she was. She walked in to prove that justice doesn't belong only to those who wear robes, carry briefcases, or sit behind polished desks. Sometimes it belongs to the person no one saw coming, the person who refuses to sit quietly and be misunderstood. In a world where power is often mistaken for authority, Arianna reminded us that true power lies in preparation, in knowledge, and in the refusal to be silenced. She didn't just defend herself, she held a mirror up to a system that too often runs on assumptions and convenience. Her victory wasn't about walking free, it was about forcing that system to look at itself and blink. And that's the lesson that echoed far beyond courtroom walls. Justice doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it rises from the very person the system tried to overlook. Arianna's story is a reminder that the fight for truth isn't reserved for lawyers with years of experience or judges with decades on the bench. It belongs to anyone willing to stand up, speak clearly, and refuse to let silence be mistaken for guilt. Because the truth doesn't need a title. It just needs someone brave enough to tell it. And if you believe that intelligence isn't defined by age, that courage isn't reserved for the powerful, and that anyone, no matter their background, can hold the system accountable, then this story is for you. Let Arianna's voice be more than a viral moment. Let it be a call to think critically, to speak boldly, and to prepare like your future depends on it. Because one day it just might. If her story inspired you, even for a moment, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to X Daily Stories for more true-to-life narratives that challenge, uplift, and awaken. Because next time, the person being underestimated might not be Arianna. It might be your friend, your sister, your child. Or maybe it'll be you. And when that day comes, may you be ready, not just to defend yourself, but to change the story entirely.